will call you on the stage, Michael. Please, everyone, give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Michael Cronin.
Thank you, everybody. Everybody can hear me okay? Because I'm always worried about these concealed mics that somehow sit in the switch or something like that and not be heard. One of the things that struck me just in that poll that came in was the opposition of two words, love, hate. And one of the things that I'm going to try and explore this morning is, if you like, the way in which our relationship to translation and the relationship to the context of translation is something that is motivated by deep love, but in some ways may have very hateful consequences. And how are we going to deal with, how are we going to, if you like, cope with that in various ways? Because one of the things that struck me about the kind of the tagline for the conference is this notion of going beyond translating text. And I've been teaching translation now, practicing it for over 30 years. And one of the first things that you do in the classroom is to talk about context, about how words take on their meaning because of their contextual frames. And so if we talk about context in respect of pedagogy, we think about it in terms of our practice, what does it mean in terms of the profession, in terms of what translation is and does? So what I want to do in the time that I have this morning is to look at some of the elements of that context. And I'm going to look specifically at a particular kind of context. If I can get my slides up here on the screen, because I see myself, but they're coming now. Great. Okay.
Kind of coming.
There we are. Yep. It's. I want to. Some of you in this room and some of you online may remember this event. It was 2010. It was the eruption of a volcano in Iceland. Eyjafjallajökull. I had to practice that one, and I'm sure the Icelandic scholars in the room are utterly appalled at the slurred pronunciation. But you do remember that this was a kind of foretaste of pre-pandemic, of a kind of pandemic lockdown, where flights were grounded for several days, people couldn't move, and so on. What's interesting about that particular volcano is that it emitted about 150,000 tons of carbon. Now, humans at present emit something like 100 million tons of carbon per day. Now, for the mathematicians in the audience and the mathematicians online, try dividing 100 million by 150,000. And what you come up with is 666. The number of the devil. So there's a sense in which, of course, what is utterly diabolical about the carbon emissions is that they are likely to imperil our future. So what I want to try and do is to consider what are the, if you like, the consequences for us as translators in terms of how we think about our practice, the kind of translation that we need to do, how we need to think about the tools that we use when we're doing translations, and how do we think, if you like, in terms of longer time spans, in terms of what I'm going to call deep time as opposed to very short, immediate, proximate human historical time. André Snær Magnusson, the Icelandic writer and activist, thinking about the volcano, thinking about the notion that we're living on a planet where this volcano is erupting day and night 666 times per day. And he says, when a system collapses, language is released from its moorings. Words meant to encapsulate reality hang empty in the air, no longer applicable to anything. Textbooks are rendered obsolete overnight, and overly complex hierarchies fade away. People suddenly find it difficult to hit upon the right meaning, to articulate concepts that match their reality. So to some extent, if you like, for us as translators, for people who work with language all the time, what happens then, if you like, when translation or when language is in a sense overwhelmed by a particular kind of planetary context? To try and put some kind of shape on this, and to think how we might think about this, I want to kind of reflect briefly on my 30 years practicing, teaching, studying translation and how it operates and has evolved and so on. And what I want to argue is there's basically three sort of different paradigms that we've used to look at how translation, how the texts interact with the context. The first is what I'm going to call the ethnocentric, the second is the geocentric, and finally the terracentric. So the ethnocentric is basically looking at how translators change the fortunes and destinies of their societies. In other words, how the translation of scientific texts, how the translation of religious texts, how the translation of political texts change the course, the development of specific national societies. And to some extent, this was very much a kind of a paradigm that dominated a lot of translation research in the 1980s and 1990s. And then, of course, what happens from the late 80s onwards, with the fall of the Iron Wall, with the electronification of the stock exchange, reduction in tariffs and trade barriers and so on, is we get the rise of globalization as the dominant paradigm. So here we're basically looking not so much at national endogenous developments, we're looking at the transnational flow of people, services, goods, ideas. It's when we begin to hear in great detail about internationalization, localization, in the language services industry. And what I would argue is that now we're moving into, if you like, a third phase, which is what I would call the terracentric paradigm. So the terracentric paradigm is one where we are engaged in a process which still, of course, is transnational. We're still, if you like, as all of you here in this room are, engaged in the circulation of ideas, goods, services across different languages and different cultures. But what we now have to be mindful of is the extent to which our lives are localized, spatialized, are lives that are determined by the immediate material circumstances in which we live as a result of the ecological crisis. So, in terms of this terracentric paradigm then, thinking about translation in its relationship to the planet and an ecological context, what kinds of things might we begin to look at? So what I want to look at first is what I'm going to call the resource unconscious. So basically the things that sort of underpin the activities that we engage in. Then I'm going to look at the question of mobility, and particularly the question of mobility and migration as a result of the climate emergency, and what the consequences may be for translation. Then, and this is where in the very, very kind introduction, Aminda mentioned that I might be taking you to places that you didn't expect to go. And I think this is the section where that's likely to emerge. I'm going to suggest that we may have to think about very, very different kinds of translation into the future. Then I might talk very briefly, if I have time, and I might kindly ask for a time check, maybe around about maybe 10 minutes before my time is up, because I can't watch my watch and look at you at the same time. And then I want to talk about this question of the power of words. Why I think translators, you're not going to save the planet, but I think you have a very, very important role to play in how we might think about redemptive or restorative practices in terms of planetary outcomes. And this, if you like, is very much in keeping with this notion of the power of words. Why I think words are powerful in terms of how we think about particular kinds of ecological or environmental outcomes. Let me begin with the notion of the resource unconscious. The resource unconscious is basically the idea which I get to some extent from a Belgian philosopher, a man who teaches here in Brussels, a man called Pascal Chabot, a book from 2015 called L'âge des transitions, where Pascal Chabot talks about what he calls the black box of our society. And what he means by the black box of our society is the way in which the thing that drives our society is the thing that remains most invisible. He carries out a thought experiment. I want each of you in the room to think about this for a few moments. In the languages that you speak, use, know, think about how many poems, plays, novels in your language or languages talk about fossil fuels. Can you remember the last time you saw a play on stage in your language that had fossil fuels as the direct and immediate topic of that play? Chabot's survey of different European languages and cultures is that the number of texts that do this are vanishingly small. And the reason for that is that energy is the kind of the dirty secret of our society. What I term the Eco Translation book, the kind of resource unconscious of our society. So when we look at books like Ethan Zuckerman, who is the head of the MIT Civic Media Lab, his book, Rewire, or Richard Baldwin's, who is professor of economics in the Graduate Institute in Geneva, his book, The Globotics Upheaval, both of them make a very, very strong case for the link between translation and technology in ways that would be understandable to us. What does Zuckerman says? He says that one of the consequences of the rise of social media, of the rise of the digital, is a provincialization of people's minds. What he did was he carried out extensive surveys of online social media usage, and he found the vast majority of people, over 90%, if you like, put up posts in their own language, to their own people, in their own culture. When they were consulting internet sources, it was mainly in their own language, in their own culture, in their own country. And who carried with them different sets of friends to the new space. So what he argues, and this of course is music to our ears here as translators, is we need to put translation at the heart of the digital picture. The only way of overcoming digital provincialism is the use of translation. And he suggests the way we do this is two ways. One is the use of volunteer translation, and the other is the use of what he calls human computation, which is basically an idea he takes from Louis van Aan, where you kind of couple Duolingo with Ray Captcha, and so those words that you type in to show that you are human and not a robot, which then allows for the digitization of particular texts, that this will be captured via Duolingo to produce or to allow for the widespread translation of texts. Okay? So here we have very much an idea of translation futures being linked to digital futures. The robotics revolution, Richard Baldwin argues that what's happening at present is the convergence of what he calls AI, we know, artificial intelligence, and what he calls remote intelligence. So remote intelligence is that when you combine machine translation and telepresencing technologies, that this allows for people all over the world who, even if they don't speak the dominant language of the corporation, to be able to take part in the activities of the corporation and therefore make a living, if you like, working in a language that is not theirs, but which is mediated through machine translation, and where through telepresencing technologies they can be spatially remote. So we may have serious reservations about some of the ethical implications of this in terms of volunteer translation. We may have doubts about the excessive claims that might be made for MT in this particular kind of context, and the vision that Baldwin has for this kind of globotics upheaval. But the one thing that I think we need to think about even more deeply is the notion of the resource unconscious, because currently we produce about 2.5 billion bytes of data per day. So, 2.5 quintillion. So quintillion is 10 to the power of 18, or 1,000 raised to the power of 6. According to Cisco, our production of data will increase 1,000-fold over the next 20 years. So there's this, when we look at the number of digital devices that we have, currently we have about 28 billion. We have 9.26 billion, and it's likely to climb to around 28, 29 billion by 2025. The fact that we have more and more digital devices, that usage is becoming more and more personalized, that the bit rate of our content keeps increasing all the time, that we move from 3G to 4G to 5G and so on. So what all of this means then is that the energy consumption, which according to some predictions may consume up to 20% of our electricity by 2025, the ICT industry. This is increasing at an ever faster rate. So is there a sense then in which in translation we have to think about the resource unconscious, about what is going on in our black box? Your typical laptop has around about 15 to 16 hazardous metals. It has 22 metals that are difficult to source, are scarce, or can only be sourced in particularly dangerous conditions. Around 70% of IT devices are recycled in unsafe and unsanitary conditions for the people who are engaged in the recycling. So there's all of these things, if you like, that are part of this resource unconscious, the things that are in the black box that we tend not to think or talk too much about in the translation world. So there are two ways then of so these, if you like, are some of the hateful consequences of the things or the activities that we engage in daily. So what are the kinds of things then we can do about it? Well, we could argue that there are two ways of looking at this question. One is what I'm going to call supply-side ecology, and the other is demand-side ecology. Supply-side ecology is basically the idea that what you try to do in terms of your energy provision is you use IT to combat the consequences of IT. So you use smart technologies in order to reduce energy consumption. You try to switch to renewables as much as possible. You use things like long-range Wi-Fi networks that have been used in places like rural Catalonia, the Kerala state in India, where you recycle a lot of the materials. You reduce energy consumption, where in certain countries in Africa you use things called data mules, where you sort of piggy bank on the public transport service in order to enable data transmission. And of course, one of the things about supply-side ecology, however, this is one of the difficulties, is what's called Yevon's paradox, which dates back to 1865, which is often the more efficient your energy consumption, the more demand increases. We see this with DVDs. It is much more energy efficient to watch a DVD online than to produce, distribute, and sell a DVD. The problem is, however, that the DVD that you buy, you might look at it several times over the course of your lifetime, but when you look at online streaming services, you watch more and more and more, if you like, DVDs or films. So this is one of the paradoxes, if you like, supply-side ecology has to deal with. The other, which is arguably more controversial, and this is why I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A section afterwards, is what's called demand-side ecology. And this is basically what do we do with something like translation? Translation, because of the tools that we use, has an ecological cost. So if it has an ecological cost then, do we have to think about translation as a kind of a scarce good? Right? Because one of the things, one of the arguments that we make for translation, this is why such a powerful argument in the localization and internationalization industry, is with translation you sell more and more goods and services to more and more people in more and more areas of the planet. That's the kind of raison d'etre of the localization and internationalization industry. The difficulty is, of course, can we, in terms of the carrying capacity of the planet, have a kind of infinite growth in goods and services? Do we need to develop, if you like, some form of what's sometimes called digital connoisseurship, where we decide that we're going to prioritize certain kinds of translation over other kinds of translation? Are we going to prioritize forms of translation whose impact is largely positive from a social and environmental point of view, rather than other kinds of translation? What, for example, should be the priority given to translation in the gaming industry in terms of the kind of the energy costs or consequences of particular kinds of translation? So this, if you like, means that in terms, one of the things that we've been thinking about for many, many decades in translation are the conditions of the production of translation, how we produce good, efficient, effective translations. But now, in the current age, do we have to think about the conditions of the reception of translation? In other words, what kinds of translation are likely to have the best possible social or environmental outcomes in terms of, if you like, the energy costs that are embedded in the production of translations? A further question, if you like, in the context of this is one of the key words in talking about environmental damage is this word of extractivism, the way in which particular resources, minerals, fossil fuels are extracted in a way that has baleful or negative environmental consequences. Do we have to think about extractivism, for example, in the translation industry, in translation itself, where translations that are produced by translators, often for public institutions, are then monetized by private firms for machine translation systems. And in this respect, is there a sense in which we have to think about the notion of the ghost worker? The ghost worker is a concept that's been developed by economists in different spaces. You can see there on the screen the name of three of them, economists and sociologists, who have looked at how much of the digital economy, which can often present itself as a kind of an automatic, machine-driven thing, is underpinned by a plethora of workers working globally, often in very poor conditions with low wages, who, if you like, service the kind of the digital behemoth. Is there a sense in which translators could potentially, or maybe indeed are already potentially, become a part of that army of ghost workers? Is there a sense in which, when we think about restorative rather than extractivist politics, we have to think about translation from what's called a data as labor rather than a data as capital point of view? So data as capital is basically where you extract the data. The people who produce the data get very little from it. It's largely monetized by the people who use the data, whereas the data as labor point of view is the notion that users get paid for the data that they generate. Do we need to look at things like blockchain technology in order to track translational inputs into various forms of machine translation output? The difficulty, of course, blockchain technology, it is hugely, its consumption is enormous from the point of view of energy. But you see the idea of some form of tracking to allow us to look at those particular inputs. One of a man called Hans Svenning, a Danish demographer, looking at the history of human settlements, found that in the last 6,000 years, most humans have settled in what he calls the Mediterranean temperate region. So right from eastern China to Western Europe to the United States. You find whole swathes of a population have settled in an area whose temperature is an average 13 degrees Celsius. At present, on the planet, about 1% of the global surface has an average temperature of 29 degrees Celsius, and that is largely in the Sahara region of Africa. By 2050, 3.5 billion people will live in areas whose average temperature is, now that's the average temperature, is 29 degrees Celsius. The problem when the average temperature is 29 degrees Celsius and above is that it becomes humanly impossible to work outdoors. The International Association for Migration estimates that by 2050, 1.5 billion people on the planet will move because they will desperately need to move to cooler, higher areas of the planet. So what are the consequences then of this kind of climate migration for the kind of translational policies that we have? I mean, one of the things that we could ask ourselves is think back to your translation education. Think back to the range of languages that were on offer to you. And ask yourself how many of the very important world languages that are spoken, how many of those languages were on offer in your curriculum. In other words, as the pressures of climate migration increase, the question for translation won't just be, if you like, crisis translation in terms of dealing with specific outcomes in a particular place, the outfall of a natural catastrophe. What we will be dealing with are the consequences, the linguistic consequences for society, what I call intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic multilingualism, and how, if you like, are we going to meet the needs of populations that are going to be increasingly different in terms of their language composition. In other words, can we, if you like, remain with the relatively restricted language palette that we have at present in terms of translation provision and translation service? One of the central arguments that's been made in terms of the climate crisis and the climate emergency is what's called the end of human supremacy. In other words, the idea, which came from different traditions in this part of the world through the kind of Cartesian and Christian tradition of, humans as being the kind of, in the words of Descartes, the maîtres et possesseurs de la nature, the masters and possessors of nature, the kind of the Christian injunction to Adam to name all the plants and animals and sort of take possession of the earth. So this notion of the more than human world being at the service of the human has now been fundamentally challenged because the earth is coming back and is biting us hard. It's biting us increasingly hard. So that means then that we have to think about less, if you like, vertical relationships in our relationship to the environment and more in terms of horizontal relationships. And we can already see this, if you like, in certain areas of constitutional law and in what's called eco-jurisprudence, where rivers, forests, mountains, seas are being given legal rights. They're being constituted, if you like, as legal entities in their own right, which, ironically, is something that prevailed in certain areas of medieval canon law in Europe. What that means, of course, this poses a very, very big question, is the question of what we call post-Holocene governance. So Holocene, the kind of the period where there's the warming up after the Ice Age, which sees the appearance of translation in its written form. We get writing instruments, the emergence of settled civilizations, and so on. But what as we move out of that era into the age of the Anthropocene, of human-induced climate change, then we have to think about what our relationship is then to the more than human world. And one of the things that implies is communication across difference. Because what defines translation? Translation is fundamentally about translation across difference. So if we are going to give legal representation to mountains, rivers, streams, animals, how are we going to communicate across this difference? How are we going to represent these radically different forms of alterity? And one of the most interesting areas in current translation research is interspecies communication. Very interesting project in London called the Cetaceous Translation Initiative, initiative led by Michael Bronstein and his team, which is looking about whale-human translational interactions. There's the Earth Species project, which is using deep learning techniques and artificial intelligence to look at the possibility of developing forms of translation between humans and other species. So, if you like, one of the things that the post-Holocene governance is inviting us to speculate on is how we broaden or rethink in a fundamental way the idea or the notion of translation. One of the most, or I suppose two of the most prolific writers on trying to imagine forms of democratic governance that would include the more than human world are two thinkers called Anthony Burke and Stephanie Fishel. And they envisage what they call a UN Earth Systems Council, which would be like a kind of ecological equivalent of the UN Security Council. And then you had an eco-regional assembly, which would have 15 different regions that would correspond to the main eco-biomes on the planet. But again, what they envisage as part of their system is that the different elements of this more than human world would be there in a representative capacity. And then you have to think about what are the translational consequences of this representational capacity. There's the demand that non-humanists either speak our political language or remain mute was always cast in the wrong direction. It is we who must learn the Earth's language and reimagine the polity in its idioms. And of course, it's important there that the notion of polity is something that is expressed in its plurality. David Epstein is someone who thinks about the notion of range. And he basically, some of you in the room may be familiar with the 10,000 hours thesis, right? The idea, if you want to be good at something, football, tennis, French, golf, playing the violin, you have to devote at least 10,000 hours to it. The idea that you kind of you focus narrowly and you focus intensely on things. And we get these stories of Tiger Woods at the age of 4 already outputting his father on the golf range, of genius violinists who were scarcely out of their cot before they started playing the violin, and by dint of this hard work eventually rose to excellence. What he argues is that this is a model that is a very, very, very poor guide to effective human behavior. That the problem with that kind of specialization is that you become extremely good at detecting patterns, but you become extremely good at detecting patterns within a very narrow range. And one could argue that one of the problems, or one of the consequences of the fetish of specialization is that it has led to a kind of blindness that has produced some of the ecological consequences that we have to live with. Now, one of the ironies, of course, with translation is on the one level, on one hand, we have to specialize in particular areas in order to persuade our employers that we are employable, we can do the job that we're paid to do. But on the other hand, if you look at the biographies of most translators, indeed I suspect most of you here in the room, you have operated across a very, very wide range of different areas: language, culture, science, technology, history, and so on. And it seems to me that that particular kind of ontological or personal property of translators, this sense of the ability to be able to move your mind across different terrains, what is sometimes dubbed faraway thinking, that this is something that will be a crucial ecological asset in the period ahead. And it's in this period ahead that I want to come back to the word that came up at the beginning of our session this morning, which is the word love, which an Irish writer, John McGarhan, said is the most dangerous four-letter word in the language. Because it can leave all sorts of unhappy outcomes. But I'm going to talk about the happier ones. Robert Macfarlane is an English scholar, nature writer, travel writer. And in 2007, he read an article about the new edition of the Oxford Junior Dictionary. And in this article, they talked about words that were left out of the dictionary. Words like acorn, ash, adder, pasture, willow. So words that refer to fairly common plants, trees, pasture, an idea in English or in the British landscape. And he began to wonder what kind of world were the children being offered, where these very, very common words to describe the more than human world around them was gradually being regarded as redundant. They no longer needed these words. So what Macfarlane argued was that increasingly the landscape was becoming a blandscape. That you weren't identifying, you just talked about the hill over there, or the tree over there, or the river over there. Whereas once you begin to identify the particular kind of tree, the particular kind of mountain, the particular kind of cloud formation, then you have to think in more detail about the world. So he wrote a book called Landmarks in 2015, where he talked about various writers whom he described as particularizers. So what he meant by that was that they, in talking about or describing the landscape, believed in the power of words to capture the landscape. And he says, while writing about the landscape often begins in the aesthetic, it ends in the ethical. So what he meant by that was that the more you write precisely and accurately and knowingly using language about the more than human world, the more kind of implicated, the more involved you become in that world, because then you begin to realize it in all of its diversity, its complexity, its specificity, and so you feel a sense of connection. So that basically language leads to knowing, and knowing leads to caring, which means, of course, that this is one of the most powerful ways of, if you like, combating the kind of fatal disconnect that we feel with respect to language. He talks about one writer called Barry Lopez, and he says, who wrote about the Arctic, and he says, Lopez's intense intentiveness, because the Arctic was often seen as this kind of blank space, a kind of a white Siberia. And what Lopez does in his language is he describes the remarkable detail, the intensity, the kind of the populated nature of these supposedly empty landscapes. He says his intense attentiveness was a form of moral gaze born of his belief that if we attend more closely to something, then we're less likely to act more selfishly towards it. So what I would argue is that translators are particularizers. Translators, and this includes all of you here in this room, all of the people who are watching us online this morning, all of you are deeply, deeply involved in the kind of thickets of detail of your language. You are particularizers. That's why you do what you do. And it seems to me that we have this extraordinary resource as translators that can be repurposed in the broader social sphere in terms of using language to mobilize people to concern about to feel concerned about the more than human world. I often have this dream of a kind of network of eco-colleges across Europe that would have translators at the heart of these eco-colleges, working with students at primary level, at secondary level, at tertiary level, where they would be drawing the students into the extraordinary capacity of their different languages to detail the landscapes, the more than human world that these students are immersed in. And this form of knowing immersion is something that would then bring a sense of attention or care. I mean, one of the reasons that I think that this is especially important, and I'll conclude on this, is that one of the most lucid commentators on the question of climate change is an Indian writer called Amitav Ghosh. And Amitav Ghosh says that one of the things that characterized the great realist novel, the novel of Balzac, Dickens, and so on, is that they talked about things that were likely to happen. So instead of talking about the gods and mythology and unlikely events in the pantheon, you talked about the ordinary, everyday lives of people. So what the realist fiction was about was writing credible stories about ordinary, everyday lives. And anything that was improbable or bizarre was in the realm of science fiction and fantasy literature. What Ghosh argues is that we're now living not in the era of the plausible, but the era of the implausible, of outcomes that are far in excess of what we normally anticipate things to be. So translators, it seems to me, I would argue, are uniquely placed as particularizers as people who are gifted with a particular kind of range of human knowledge, people who have kind of knowing interaction with tools, to be able to think about the context to our texts and how we might, in all kinds of both plausible but also implausible ways, think about post-Holocene governments, interspecies communication and so on, how we might react to the challenges that are ahead of us. I would have talked more about deep time, but I realized I'm running out of human time, so I'm going to shut up now, and we very much welcome your questions, comments, queries. Thank you.
Wow. I don't know about you, but that kind of blew my mind a little bit, particularly about the interspecies communication. It's actually interesting, we always think that we're the center of the world, but actually human beings are a really, 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 really minuscule amount of part of the life on this planet. There are many more plant species than there are human beings and all that. So it's very interesting to hear it from that point of view and how we actually need to have this communication. You talked about translation to overcome digital provincialism, but actually it's perhaps digital speciesism we need to be overcoming. Now we have lots of questions come in, so I'm going to go with the ones with the most votes first. We'll also get them on the screen, so you should be able to see them. I'm going to go to one from Delia, and Delia, is machine translation more environmentally friendly than human translation? We've been having a lot of discussions about machine translation, so obviously they're very interested to hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the difficulty in terms when we talk about machine translation and its energy consequences is this is a very deeply divided area. I mean, to what extent there's kind of one school of thought that would argue that digital tools are actually at the heart of the solution because they will produce, if you like, ways of reducing energy consumption, alternatives to forms of high energy consumption, and so on. And this is very, very deeply divided, and it's difficult sometimes to know who to believe in all of this. But I think where the human translation comes into the picture in terms of for me, it's more in terms of the demand-side ecology and the input of human translators into demand-side ecology. In other words, is that, it's what we use our translation resources for. In other words, I think sometimes there's an excessive concentration on the supply side of things. And this is where, and if you concentrate on that, you can then tend to very, very often kind of privilege the machine MT end of things. Whereas I think if you begin to ask the much, much harder question, which is, maybe we do need to radically reduce our production of goods and services of particular kinds. Maybe we need to think about a notion of prosperity without growth. That's a really, really hard issue. I mean, and we know, many of you are familiar with all the issues around degrowth and so on, and the kind of debates that come from that. And to what extent are we kind of anthropologically prepared for the kinds of shifts in corporate and business practice that would imply? I mean, these are hard questions. So my feeling is that to some extent that it's not an either or. It's both and. I think what we need to work out in terms of energy consumption terms is what are the optimal forms of complementarity between human translation and machine translation, rather than, I think, coming up with some kind of dichotomous privileging of either one end of the pole or the other.
And in fact, our next, the second question is very similar. It's a similar kind of question about the energy and data uses and saying that it's not very environmentally friendly. I think people are trying to find an excuse to stop using machine translation, perhaps. I could be getting it wrong, but perhaps that's a hidden subtext underneath all of this. So again, it's something that, and how translators can take it into consideration.
I think the important thing here is that there has to be knowingness just about. I mean, one of the things that struck me during the pandemic, was the this massive shift to online communication and so on, and people were talking about potential reductions in energy consumption and so on. But it's almost as if the virtual had no material consequences. I mean, I live in a country which has the kind of Dublin's kind of data center hub of Europe. I mean, the average EU data center consumption of the grid is around about 3.2%. In Ireland, it's 14% and rising. These are very, very energy hungry centres. And one of the difficulties, this goes back to Jeevan's paradox, is that the more energy efficient you make them, the greater the incentive to kind of monetize the capacity that's there in the data centre itself, which then drives demand even further upwards. So I think what is important is to remember that whether we use human or MT, we really have to be mindful of the energy consequences, which then, of course, has consequences for, if translation is a scarce resource, what should we use it for?
Because, I mean, can you really see a world where we'll refuse to translate, I don't know, something for a product or something that could be bad for the world in a wider sense?
Well, I think it's raised the question of agency, and I'm always asked this very, very, very understandably so. Do you really expect me as a translator working, in the southern suburb of Dublin I need to feed the kids and pay the rent and pay my bills to refuse this job? And I don't think that it's individual autonomy in this, I think, is extremely restricted. I think what is not restricted is structural agency. And I think structural agency is, and this is why I'm extraordinarily honoured and gratified to be invited to address a forum like this one, where you have both institutional and corporate presence here, in terms of speaking at fora like this, where, initially, I remember particularly when I was talking about interspecies communication, people said, "Cronin, you're barking mad." I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, talking to my dog, I talk to my dog and cat every day, but do you seriously think this is a model for the planet? So it's this kind of, so initially, of course, when we raise these arguments, they're considered to be peripheral, bizarre, eccentric, but then they spread through people's thinking, and it's when it gets to the level of potential structural agency then I think that's when you begin to make changes, rather than, I think, the rather unfair thing of expecting, a freelance translator who's very isolated to make those kinds of decisions.
So when you talk about structural agency, how do you imagine that working? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is that, the debate is beginning in fora like this, and then fora like this, for example, DGT here, it interacts with other parts of the Commission, and then, if you like, by form of sort of almost capillary action, it spreads from one section to people begin to raise this. Well, maybe we need to think about, in terms of how we're going to use our translation budget and the energy consequences of this budget. Do we have to think about renewables? Do we have to think about the human-machine balance? Do we have to think about what we're using for? So gradually this begins to spread. Remember, there's so many things. Slavery was the most lucrative business on the planet. In proportional terms, slavery was worth more than the digital industry today, and yet the unimaginable happened and slavery was ended. In 1969, there was not a single female member in the Parliament in Paris. Not a single female member in the Assemblée Nationale. And where are we now? In other words, there is this kind of capillary where things spread, but I do think we have to think about structural agency, and it always appears naive. Because to some extent, it's the optimists that are the ultimate realists, because they have to be. If we're not optimistic, the planet is doomed. Right? So it has to be. The Italian political philosopher Antonio Gramsci talked about what he called optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect. That some days you think, I'm not so sure. There's so much against me, but you still have to believe.
Okay, we've got plenty of questions online. Any questions in the room? Okay, there's a lady over there.
My name is Clara, and I'm from University of Osijek. I would like to go back to the topic of digital provincialism. I guess it's kind of a boogeyman, and you mentioned, I guess, a solution of volunteering. But how would volunteering work to prevent it? Could you mention some more specific examples, like explain it?
Yeah. The first thing I should say is that I'm just a messenger. This is Zuckerman's idea. Basically, he argues that if you look at the volunteers who produced these translations for the TED Talks, for example, and there was a period of time when it's done for Facebook as well. He sees this, as a potential model that people are filled, if you like, with a kind of humanitarian global benevolence, and they're prepared to. And this is, for example, in this eco-translation book I did in 2017, I was deeply critical of this model, because what it basically leads to is the demonetization of translation, and the demonetization of translation leads to the deprofessionalization of translation, and basically, it's part of a particular paradigm, and we see this with internships in so many companies today, where we've now reached the kind of end point where it's no longer a question of working for terrible wages. Now you work for no wages at all. And there's a kind of a notion that translators should... So I find that his notion of a kind of digital translational benevolence is underpinned by something very dark. Dark is the kind of extractivism, the kind of the exploitation of volunteer translations. And the other is a complete disregard for the if you like, the material cost of virtual technologies, which need to be factored into the picture. So just to reassure you, I was just conveying that message rather than approving of it. Yeah, thank you.
Please don't shoot the messenger. We have time for one last question, which is really a shame because I could have sat here and asked you loads of questions, and we have a lot online. But we're talking about thinking about the material consequences of what we do, and I think this is a good one to kind of round off, which is from Magali, and it says, what are some of the steps we should take to have less impact in the environment as we translate?
Yes, I did a piece recently for the Linguist, the Institute of Linguists publication in Britain, and so one of the things I was arguing is that, I'm thinking this from the point of view of a freelance translator I'm working at, and to ask yourself, who is my energy provider? Do I always, so in other words, can you switch to an energy provider that depends a lot more on renewables? Do I always need wireless connections? Because if you have a wired connection, you reduce your energy consumption. Is there a sense in which I can, within the realms of the possible, kind of ecologically calibrate my output? In other words, is there some kinds of translation that I can do that is likely to have positive social and environmental consequences? In other words, can you arrive at some sort of compromise or balance between the two? And also, and I think this is kind of sort of looking to the future, maybe a certain sense of linguistic preparedness for the consequences of climate migration. Why not learn particular languages that are likely to be in demand or a need in order to facilitate what is going to be, and we have to accept it's going to be a fairly radical recomposition of our populations as a result of the extreme pressures that will come from global warming. We are on a we are on a continent that has whose temperatures have risen twice as fast as any other continent on this planet in the last 30 years. So we certainly know what we're talking about in the years ahead.
Well, Michael, thank you for that incredible, advice as well. Look into some of those languages. It's certainly a future. We have a lot of freelancers and a lot of young translators who are just starting off in this conference. So I think that's a really good tip for them to think about ways for the future and to also be able to be, let's say, to use their power of words in the right way, also for us and for the planet. So thank you. Please give a big round of applause to our keynote speaker. Amazing. Thank you. Don't go anywhere because we're going to start the next session very, very soon, and I'm going to hand over to Anya.
Yes, don't go anywhere. We're just setting up, so just sit in your seats, have a think about some of those very uplifting and very thought-provoking comments